As I said earlier, we are in, it's going to start in Luke chapter 14. As we continue our thoughts and discussion on discipleship and what that looks like, and the various challenges that brings. We can get a larger context of this, and then we'll dive into some of the text. Starting in verse 25 of Luke 14. Now great crowds accompanied him, and he turned and said to them, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, and yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whomever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid the foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it will begin to mock him, saying, 'This man began to build and was not able to finish.' Or what king, going out to encounter another king in war, will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is to be thrown away. He who has ears, let him hear." We already discussed the opening verses 25 through 27 with Scott's lesson a few weeks ago, and evaluated that text. Main takeaway, at least to my recollection in the discussions we had, was that in order to follow me, you must love me. You must value me more than you do anyone else in your life. One big takeaway. And another highlight, a phrase that stood out to me in that section was the idea at the very end of that section, starting at 27, "For whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." And we kind of reduced that phrase, at least in that class, to the idea of embracing the burdens that comes with discipleship, owning them, recognizing that they will come, and following Christ, and gladly taking up your cross and everything that entails. But as I was considering the audience who would have heard this phrase, this would have been a very bewildering point to bring up and a very odd image to use in a sermon. He hasn't died yet. He hasn't been crucified. This symbol that he's referencing is still one of tyranny, of oppression, of torture. And so referencing taking up your cross daily, they wouldn't even be understood the ramifications or the significance of that was, only until after he had completed his sacrifice. So from this lesson, Christ starts with, in order to follow me, if you want to be a good disciple, you have to hate your family, and you have to take up a Roman torture device on your back and follow me. It's no wonder that he ends with the idea of whoever has ear to hear, let him hear. He starts with a very complex, distant, and even undefined idea at the beginning. It's very much akin to the way he conducts parables. He's not saying a parable right now, but he's speaking in a very obtuse language to make people think and make people want to question as he dig deeper. Let me see anything else in those verses. I want to make sure I reference Scott's material before moving on, because this concept builds off of the points that Christ initiates. Yeah.
The only other thing is, I think, confusing, especially that take up your cross, but also just repugnant. Because it's not just death, it's the death of a criminal. Right? So there's shame and all that into that concept as well.
Yeah. So it's not just death and even painful death. There's a great deal of shame that is accompanied with that form. Yeah.
I just think it's amazing. It says you've got a large crowd. This huge crowd is following him. He turns. He's pushing them away. He's like, you don't want to follow me. If you want to follow me, you're going to hate your family and you're going to die.
Yeah, so he's glad you brought that up. So the context is he's no longer at the party with the Pharisee. That was earlier. We're at a different scene now. He's with a large group. They're out presumably out in the countryside. And this is his opening line to the group. You want to follow me? And then comes the rest of the intro. Not a good way to start most of the time if you want to start assembling a following. Yeah.
Hate seems to be an awful harsh word to use here. I'm just wondering if love me more than men, seems to me to be a better way to phrase it. Hate seems to be an awful harsh word.
Yeah. So yeah, again, pointed to the fact that he uses intense language. Scott did a really good job of comparing the fact that it's not literally hate. It's the idea I love Christ so much more. So by comparison, my degree of affection for my fellow man, from even my own blood, is akin to hate. It's that low because I consider my Christ that much more. Anything else before moving on to the next section of verses? Okay. And 28 through 32, thoughts on this section. What is the fundamental idea he's presenting here? And 28 through 32. It's ultimately going to culminate in 33, where he draws his conclusion. Counting the cost. So he starts with this really, as Kevin mentioned, a really tough opener. And then as he leads with that, he follows up immediately with, consider the cost. What I offer is incredible. It's amazing. It'll change your life, but it's going to cost you everything. And he doesn't try to sugarcoat it. He doesn't try to make his message that much more appealing, enlighten it, or broaden it to a lot of different classes and groups. He says, if you want to follow me, consider the cost. This is a heavy thing that I'm asking you. Anything else in that section of verses there?
Kind of reminds me of a weed out course at Purdue. The engineers, they have these, I never did it because I'm not one of them, but I heard about these horrible classes right up at the very beginning, and it just told the kids whether or not they want to keep going that way.
Mm-hmm. Scott making a comparison for those online that there's some difficult courses sometimes in universities that is just intended to weed out those who are not going to stay with the course material. And yeah, very similar motivation you can see at play here. Yeah.
Scott's comment triggered me with ESG. And this is, I do not want to discuss this, I just want to throw this idea out there to consider. I was studying this one time, and somebody brought up a different take on this section, that if you read it as Christ is the one building the tower, he's building the tower with us, we're the blocks. He's considering how much it costs. Is he going to put shaky blocks? Is he going to put blocks that aren't, firm and strong? And so there's a way you can read this to where Jesus is saying, who doesn't count the cost? I'm building something huge. I'm not going to take half-hearted disciples to build that. And again, I'm not trying to argue with, because I know we always traditionally take it as us counting the cost, but it made a lot of sense in the context that Jesus sort of posed it. He couldn't be posing it that way as well.
Interesting. I hadn't heard of that take before. Kevin, something else or building off of?
Just quickly related to that, I think we do a disservice when we are evangelizing, when we are teaching people about God's goodness, salvation in Christ. If we don't tell them, this costs everything, but it's worth it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Kevin, bring up the idea that if Christ was willing to lead with this as part of his fellowship and welcoming people, we should adopt that same model. I'm not sure if I want to lead this way with every person, but it's impressive the fact that when Christ is talking to a large group of people, assumingly of very different backgrounds, that this is his opening line. So something to consider the way I approach and how I discuss my faith, and when I'm trying to make it appealing to others or share it with them, and why I've chosen this path. Very good. Other thoughts on this group of verses here?
Definitely gets you off the fence.
Yeah. You can't be sidelines. You can't be in the middle. You're in one camp, you're with me, or you're not with me. Pretty black and white. And then 33 is really the core verse of the things that we're considering tonight. Which I'll go ahead and reread that again. So therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. The thought we're considering, or the topic we're considering, is the idea of possessions or treasures. And while that's not exclusively being addressed here, we'll connect that with another passage, but it would involve this idea. The material possessions that we own, the gifts we've been blessed with, that would be definitely included within this collection of everything he's talking about renouncing. In context, I think he's talking about much more than that. Like we already talked about family, so you're going to renounce, blood, relationships, ties. That way, you're going to renounce entire groups of people, perhaps. But nestled within that, included, is tonight's theme and topic of possessions and treasures. And then he closes. This is really a transition into the next chapter, where he deals with more parables. But he closes with this line. I think Andrew mentioned it earlier. It's not used very often. The idea of, for those who can hear, hear. Those who have ears to hear, hear. But with that, he also closes with a warning. Starting in 34 rather. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is to be thrown away. And it's interesting how he nestles that kind of as the close of his intro. So it starts with, it's going to be really difficult, what I'm asking you. You're going to have to give up a lot. You're going to give up people and family, and now you're going to have to give up possessions and everything you own. And in the event that you do join me, and you're not worthy of the cause, you don't live up to this purpose, you're of no use. You're of no worth. You might have changed your whole life. You might have completely altered the way you are seen around your peers. But if it's to no effect, and if you don't commit to this, you are no longer of worth. You have lost your purpose. Not that it can't be restored, but just adding to the weight of this first paragraph that he opens with this sermon. Okay, the next section will be a little bit closer to the idea of treasures and possessions. Go ahead and turn to Matthew 6. So we're back into the Sermon on the Mount, a little further in. Matthew 6, and starting in verse 19. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be healthy and full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light is in the darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. I'm actually going to start at the end, the way he concludes. So in verse 24, no one can serve two masters, for he will hate the one and love the other, and he'll be devoted to one or despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. It's a pretty clear point. I can't really, at least I couldn't figure out ways to misconstrue this very often. The solution is choose one, and that's his message. You can only choose one. And then the solution to this idea is kind of found in the nuance of the word serve. It's the same word for being a servant or slave, but it's the idea of being devoted to. So you cannot devote yourself to two things. You will have to take precedence. The idea that these both can exist at the same time. I can have wealth and I can be with God. It's the idea of which one I'm devoting to, and that's a very different relationship. I saw a hand over here. Okay.
And that's just what I was going to mention is he's talking about putting these things above him. Because obviously we all have things, and we all have family, and we all have family that aren't believers. And it just means, we need to put Christ first. And like if you have family that wants you to do something on Sunday morning, and that's when you decide, no, we're not doing that. We're going to church or whatever.
Okay.
That's what he's talking about, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Really mirror those thoughts. I'll try to repeat those ideas, but the idea of there's a precedence, and it's the emphasis that you place on it. So it's not the fact that having money discludes the fact or negates the fact that I have a faith, that I have this connection with God. It's the idea that God comes first and everything comes second. You already tied in the fact of family again with the Luke passage, but that all comes second. Yeah, Andy.
I don't disagree with any of that. I know that I have a tendency, though, to as soon as I read that strong language from Jesus, to start finding the exception or a way to make it less than how he put it. There's a reason he worded those things that strong. And part of it is because I immediately start thinking, yeah, but. And I have to put the yeah, but, go, no. He's emphatically saying he has to be first. Now, yes, that doesn't mean that there aren't other things, but I always caution myself because I start listening immediately because that language is so strong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great point. The idea of while going through this material and appreciating that there's another side that's not addressed here, and he addresses it elsewhere at times, that to not go starting looking with caveats and finding the exception clauses, because reveals a very different part of the heart for your listeners. Good point. Other thoughts in this opening section? Yes, Steve.
First Timothy 6 is a good Andy verse to go with this. Verse 17 portrays, as for the rich in this present age, regard them not to be haughty, or to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share. But not, he has not said this long to have wealth, but what is first in your life. You can use your wealth, money, whatever, in your good works. But you don't ever want it to be your number one priority.
Absolutely. And the next section will be 19 through 21. Reading that section again so I can refresh my memory. But do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. That last verse is one that's always stuck out to me. It's very telling. It kind of leads to Andy's point. We might flesh that a little bit more. But what's Jesus' point? Don't invest in things because they depreciate over time, so it's not worth it. What's the bigger foundational idea here? Okay, they're only temporary, Stephen?
God's perspective is things that are eternal have value, things that are temporal or temporary don't have value.
Okay.
Not nowhere near the same level of value.
So
Everybody's made between the big and it's the eternal that we ought to be seeking.
okay. So the eternal, the spiritual versus the physical, two different value systems. They're not even comparable. And Christ makes that point. Elliot? Okay. And then I see Scott. Oh, yeah, you're good.
I was listening to a sermon this morning, and he was talking about how that a lot of times we Christians, we're willing to give this to God and this to God, but we save this back. It's one thing, maybe two things that we don't. These are born gods. At least we think so. And when we do that, we provide a mechanism where it's like demons bear an influence on our soul because we don't turn that over to God and let the Holy Spirit talk to us about what God thinks about these issues. Instead of giving it all up to God, we segment it and we keep back some things. And I just want to make the point, reiterate the point, that when we do that, we provide a mechanism, a way, an inroad for Satan to mess up our lives badly.
Mm-hmm. So these things that could be blessings, theoretically, inherently bring a lot of danger with them. And this is the point. honestly, not honestly, the thing I didn't quite realize until I think a few years ago is that out of all the topics Christ talks about throughout his sermons, finances is like one of the biggest. He repeatedly comes to. There's other ones that he'll touch on, but there's a lot he says about money, which is telling, given who his audience is since they were so poor. But he was saying, the majority of his people he'd be speaking to were lower class citizens who would not have been deemed as having much worth. And yet these are the people he's still reemphasizing the fact that you need to give up. There's still stuff you're holding on to. There's still stuff that you're allowing to creep in and devalue me and my Father, where I should take that special place in your heart. Anything else in this section here in these verses? Yeah. Oh, Mary. Go ahead. Judah? Yeah, Judah, reemphasizing the fact that this message is not purely for those, a warning against those who have. It's for those who don't have. Because either end of the spectrum, you could still use from want or from having excess, is still grounds for, or a place where I can lose my faith, not be devoted to God, and have my attention and motivation on other things. Very good. Yeah, Josh. No. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Money is always an issue because, like, you can give your time, but you can give it cheerfully and all that. But it's obviously, you can't give all your money away. You have to live on something. So it's always, like the early church, they sold everything they had and gave to the poor. And I always wonder how we fit in on that. I get feeling guilty about anything I have, because I think, gosh, they did that. I don't do that. I don't know anybody that does that.
Yeah.
I don't know. I get confused a lot.
Yeah, and it's, what are we called to give up? You jump to the example of the rich man, and when Christ is addressing him, he says, one thing you lack, give up everything you own and come follow me. He gave that special creed to this man because he knew the contents of his heart. But and I'm going to be very personal, I think I'm also that man. I don't have a, six-figure income or anything like that. But in my perspective, the way I look at myself in this world, I am blessed beyond measure. I am a top, 10% of the world, 10, 5, 1%. I'm up there. And yet, so that passage applies to me. So often I would see passages that refer to the Pharisees, and I would see myself as the other sinners, the tax collectors. And no, I'm the Pharisee as well. I'm the one who's well off. I'm the one who has access to scriptures and who's gatekeeping truth. I'm all these people that Christ would have been reprimanding and speaking very sternly to. And so my perspective has shifted. I don't really empathize much with or relate to the people that he was hanging out with. I relate to much more the people that he was reprimanding. Yeah.
So, don't know exactly where you're headed, and you probably are headed towards the next point. In this particular set of scriptures, we often discuss them from the idea of material wealth. What's the treasures in heaven?
Yeah.
It's a question.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry.
Okay, so Christ is comparing physical possessions on earth, seemingly. But yeah, what is the treasures in heaven? Because that's what he poses. That's the thing that he contrasts this to. So get a full appreciation of that. Good question to ask. And I'll turn it back to the class like any good teacher. What is the treasure of heaven? What is he comparing this to?
I'm not going to answer that. But a seed that I think gets to that is this passage makes so much more sense when we are completely and fully aware that we were created for eternity. When we got Ecclesiastes 3, God said eternity in your heart. When we realize that that's the image we were created in, the eternal Father, then all of a sudden everything else, the material stuff, the temporary stuff, takes its proper place. So I think tapping into the treasures of heaven has to do with that eternal nature that we're. That's a piece of it.
So one perhaps puzzle piece to that is the idea of being aware of and having that sight for eternity, and not being limited to this world. Stephen?
Yeah, maybe this is too simple, but for me, generally trying to help put this in practice is just simple things like, being a neighbor to someone. And it's when no reward is present at all. So I'm doing this not for the benefit, not for gain, and not even with an opportunity to benefit or gain. And then, in my mind, that's something that has an eternal spiritual reward. It's just loving my neighbor. And there's so many ways to do that, and so many ways to fall short of doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, oh, yeah, Elliot.
I think we oftentimes associate this treasure physically with what we're talking about, but it really comes down to what we value. And so, for me, would I rather give somebody $20 to go get some groceries, or would I rather spend an hour helping them get stuff or take care of things they need? For me, I value my time more than I value my money. Or maybe I value my attention. Um, Maybe my kids need my attention. They're going through something, but I'd rather do something else. There's a lot more that we put value on than just monetary things. And getting to what Josh was asking, I mean, I don't really know it's going to be like that, but the relationship with God is what we'll have to kind of know. And so those things, like our kids' attention, that's something that lasts. That's something that lots of us are not going to restore. The time we spend with them, or the time we spend helping somebody else, that lasts.
Yeah. Okay, so kind of combining those ideas, this idea of what lasts, what can we expect in this new kingdom when we go home, what is eternal? It's relationships. Relationships are eternal. It started with a relationship between three figures. It's going to end with a relationship with three figures and countless more. Both halves of eternity, both sides, start and end with relationships. So that is what we cultivate here on this earth. And that's the thing that we get to take with us and should be cultivating. I saw a lot of hands over there, so let's go left or right. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Scott.
We're to keep, I think Jesus is saying that you need to keep your possessions, think of those with a heavenly perspective. That what you are using your money for and how other thing that is just maybe gonna feed my instant gratification for popping something in my mouth.
So, yeah, the idea of looking at these resources, the resources themselves with a heavenly perspective, whether that be time or energy, as Elliot's saying, kind of broadening the scope a little bit beyond just finances. And how do we use those? And the idea of stewardship. Yeah, this is all temporary anyways. This is not mine, as Scott brought up. So how am I going to use the blessings I've been given? So I have to remind you some other hands. Yes, Steve.
The first part of the chapter, 2, 3, 4, gives the example of giving from the easy, not doing it, from praising Him, doing it in secret. God will reward us when we do that. So just an example of, I think, how we do helping others is a way of laying up our treasure in heaven.
Okay. So going towards the practical use, kind of going along with Elliot's thoughts as well, how we use resources to better others, to help and guide others. I think Judah was next. Okay, so one of the, I guess, side benefits apart as that transition from leaving is the idea that we were removed from distractions. And then beyond that, that peace of mind that we gain, and just, not peace of mind, just peace, being home, being whole, being with the one who made us, and having, you mentioned the idea of true worship. We're worshiping, but we're all, this is like shadow puppet play. We're doing something that's going to be much grander and whole and beyond what we can understand. Worship, when there is no boundary, there is no separation, and something else we could look forward to. Oh yeah, Mark.
You mentioned a couple of times, it was mentioned we were built for eternity, we were made for relationship. And as I'm thinking through some of this and listening to some other comments, building up of treasures in heaven, we know we were made for eternity, and we know we were made for relationship, and we know that while we cannot control how others respond and react, we know that our actions directly affect them. And we know from various passages and history the examples of treating someone with love is going to draw them in. Is it possible that that building and storing of treasures in heaven term that we use is just talking about the fact that the more relationship we build, the more relationship that there is in heaven, the greater those treasures will be. The more souls that are there, the more relation that is there, the more relationship that is there for people that are there for their purpose, the greater that that treasure ends up being. Not that it's these things that we look at, but these things easily distract us from those. Because I don't know about you, but I can't see relationship. I feel relationship, I feel effects of relationship, but I can't see it, I can't grab it. It's not something tangible that I can hold on to. And that makes it sometimes easier to overlook, easier to forget, easier to ignore, easier to treat incorrectly than something that is physical that's in front of me that I'm going to break or lose if I misuse it.
Okay. So the idea of doubling down on the idea that relationship, that's something worth laying by in store for, that's a treasure. And you bring in the idea of growth of relationships, the fact that through my works here and through my efforts, and ultimately through God's grace and the one he gets the credit, but I get to be a part of that process through his grace. I get to help grow this family, and I get to see more and more faces when I go home. And what more treasure could you want? Scott.
This is definitely an act of faith, giving up something that you maybe had thought you'd use for something else because someone else needs it. And it reminds me of so many teachings of Jesus that, whoever has more will be, whoever has more will be given, and they'll have plenty. And it reminds me of like the story of the fish and the bread. Fed 5,000 people. There's a story in the Old Testament about a widow that had jars, and they kept filling the jars. She gave up what she had, and anyway, God provided such an abundance. And I find great reassurance in this concept that if I can give something away to help somebody, God's going to provide. It's just amazing.
We won't get there, but the verses that follow this section just deal entirely with that thought of, if you just give everything to me and you trust it to me, God's going to take care of you. I will take care of you. Just quickly going through some of the other thoughts. Some things that Jesus is not saying here. He's not promoting the idea of don't own anything. Live completely apart from physical attachment. He's not promoting people to live like Diogenes. If you're familiar with him, he was a Greek philosopher, a bit graphic at times, but Diogenes was the founder, or one of the founders of Cynic philosophy, and he has this idea of abstinence. I don't want to be a part of society. I don't want to be a part of people. I don't want wealth. I don't want a house. I want to live in a barrel on a street and just take food from the market and survive. He was a grotesque man, and he had all these other thoughts that were not conducive to this kingdom, but he from a very physical standpoint, he seems to be emulating what Christ is outlining of give up physical things and don't be distracted by the cares of the world. Diogenes did that, and he was repulsive, and he was a terrible man. He didn't do any good for his people, and he was hated by others. So that's not what Christ is promoting. Don't store up, this idea of don't lay by and store physical possessions. I don't believe Christ is promoting don't save, don't plan ahead, don't invest in that 401k, don't build capital, don't diversify your assets. He's not saying don't be a good steward with your possessions. Don't be, there are still other passages and other things that he even addresses which encourage the idea of being shrewd and being wise with the blessings and the resources that you've been given. And there's plenty of other passages we can kind of go to. I am not going to get to Ecclesiastes, so we're going to keep on moving. That's not going to happen tonight. So I'll skip over to the remaining section. In 22 through 23, this middle section of still in Matthew 6. The eye is the lamp of the body, so if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light is in you, and if the light in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? Why is this detail included here? Why is this significant to the discussion he's bringing about within these set of verses?
I'm not sure where you hit it, but I think that in general, we as human beings take in things by sight first and foremost. So what we see is what goes into our brain, and so I would connect this with we see things and covet things. We want because we see it. If we didn't see it, if I was blind and there were things I never saw, I might not ever want.
Okay, so just the very basic idea of like we interact with this world through our sight, most of us. And so, yeah, and so that's how we perceive, that's how we engage, and so that influences my desire, is purely through my sight. So it touches on that. Yeah, Andy?
You said the word there. I think it's talking about what do you desire? What does your eye want? And so where our desire lies drives everything.
Going back to the idea of where your heart will be, there your treasure will be also. Flip those. But yeah, the idea that it's desire that's motivating this, that's fueling these decisions. So I see, I want. And if that's where it stops, if that's all that these citizens that he's calling to his kingdom are, is that's the entire way that they approach life, they will not be accepted. They will be that salt that is tasteless, that's lost its purpose, that no longer has worth. What you look at, what you spend your time on, what you willfully take in, and therefore deem valuable, that will determine the state of your soul, and whether it's light or darkness within me is what I allow to shine through me. If I'm peering into the Word and filling my mind in time with that, my soul is going to look very different. I don't have to have a great deal of understanding. I don't have to be a sage or a scholar. If I look at these words and the message that and have an open heart, like so many of the people would have at Christ, the time where they didn't read, they're just there to listen to this new rabbi. If they had an open heart and we had that same mindset as they, we will approach the kingdom. We will be fruitful. We will be a vessel that God can use to the furtherance of his kingdom. Other thoughts on this interim section? Well, I'll just reference Ecclesiastes. I was going to read almost the entirety of chapter 5. It goes through a long list. Ecclesiastes is one of my favorite books. We simply don't have the time. So at the end of it, Solomon comes to a very practical conclusion. So he talks about different aspects of wealth and how those who acquire wealth and hoard it, ultimately it causes their own pain and own harm. There are those who acquire wealth through long effort, and at the end of their life, they don't benefit, and not even their own children benefit. Their inheritance goes to others. And then just all these other pretty dismal things to be heard from the wisest and richest man at his time. And then his conclusion is, how am I going to regard wealth? Is that if you pursue it, it's vanity and a waste of time. If that's your goal, if that's the thing that you see, that you spend your effort and time pursuing, it will harm you. It will kill you. And then his advice, enjoy the time and the resources that you're given. Very practical. He leads with that. Enjoy it. It's a gift. And then ultimately he says it's not just a gift, it is a gift from God, which in turn means use it. Not for yourself, not even just for your family. Use it for the furtherance of his kingdom. Be thankful, be a good steward, and share freely with the wealth that God chooses to bless you with. Thank you very much.